Good morning, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome once again to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning we have a wonderful opportunity once again to talk to Harley Schlanger about the events of the day and also to get into a little bit of history because of the passing this week of George P. Shultz, someone whose shadow is very, very long cast up upon our lives today, and someone who also fit into my father's life when they were both students at Loomis School in Windsor, Connecticut. So the LaRouche organization is got a new website. It's all been reorganized and it looks terrific. LaRoucheOrganization.com. And Harley Schlanger has published a couple of articles in the past 2 days that I think are very, very relevant to both of the things I just raised. And so without further ado, let's bring Harley Schlanger up to the screen. Good morning, Harley, or good afternoon, I should say.
Yeah, guten Abend almost. How are you, John?
Great. So that makes it about 5 p.m. In Germany. Is that right?
And
Yeah.
it's dark by that time, so yeah, it's late afternoon.
And off before we went on the air, you told me you had some snow. How's that? Is that beautiful?
Yeah, we live right near a woods, and my kids are having a ball, and it's given that they're locked down, they can get outside and run around and burn off some energy, so it's great.
That's fabulous. Well, thanks for joining us again. And as I said, you sent me a couple of articles that I've been devouring as fast as I can, but I wonder if we could just use them as a springboard for our conversation today. And let's start with this one. It's called Biden Foreign Policy Defaults Back to Bush Obama with Dangerous Commitment to Geopolitics. Now, that's a lot to take on at once, but let's go ahead and if you want, just talk through your thoughts about this subject, or we can read through some of the article and comment on it, however you think best.
Well, I can give a somewhat of a summary of it. I think the most important point is that after a somewhat mixed and confusing term of Donald Trump, where at least he maintained a commitment to working with Russia and until March of last year, working with China. The Obama policy had been the pivot to Asia, which was an anti-China policy, and a very sharp anti-Russia policy. And Trump came under enormous pressure for saying he wanted to work with Putin. And he continued to pursue that throughout his 4 years. And that's why Russiagate was launched. The people who targeted Donald Trump do not want a US-Russian cooperative alliance. This has been the fear of the British going back to the time of the American Revolution, when Tsarina Catherine joined the League of Armed Neutrality, which was more or less a pro-American colonial side against the British Empire. So you have this long history. And what we saw with Trump was a break with that, an attempt to go back to maybe what you would say is the Franklin Roosevelt World War II alliance that shifted after World War II with the Cold War. Now, that's an important point because one of the things I bring up in the article is the Atlantic Council published a lengthy article this week called The Longer Telegram. And I'm sure your astute listeners will get the reference to the Long Telegram from 1946 from George F. Kennan, which became the basis of the Cold War. The idea that the Soviet Union was aggressive and we needed to contain them. So someone in the broad area of geopolitics in the deep state penned an 80-page article called The Longer Telegram, this time targeting China, and specifically saying we have to watch Xi Jinping. He's someone that we can probably focus on like a laser and bring down. So the fact that this is in the Atlantic Council is not surprising, except for one thing. The Atlantic Council was one of the groupings of the transatlantic region that targeted Trump heavily. And apparently, Trump wasn't tough enough on China for them because now they're backing this Biden policy. And let me just, in the interest of the summary, mention one other aspect here. Admiral Charles Richard, who is the commander of the Strategic Command of the United States, which is the nuclear deterrent capability, had an article in his magazine. I think it's called Proceedings. Yeah, it's the U.S. Naval Institute's magazine, monthly magazine. And his February article said, while it was unlikely previously that we would end up in a nuclear war, it now has become likely. And he goes through why it's necessary for the United States to have a massive rearmament using the most advanced nuclear technologies, just at the point where Trump and the Russians had made an agreement for a New START treaty, and Biden confirmed that in his first talk with Putin. Why are they pushing? Why is the head of the Strategic Command saying we're about to have a nuclear war, or it's likely we'll have a nuclear war with Russia and China, so we have to upgrade our capabilities? Well, this is why I wrote the article, that people who think Biden is a softie, Biden's going to concede everything, forget that he was Obama's point man on Ukraine, which was a spear aimed right at the heart of Russia. And he also was very much involved in Obama's Asia pivot, which was an anti-China policy. So it looks like we're back to the good old days of strategic confrontation with Russia and China. And that brief period where we had a promise of cooperation with Trump, which, as I said, never came to fruition, largely because of Russiagate and the preponderance of deep state people around Trump. But nevertheless, there was always a glimmer of hope. I think that glimmer of hope may be gone. And I can say a little bit more about why, but I think that's a summary of what I wrote in the article.
Wow. And it looks that way. Just the optics from where I sit, it looks like Biden is going to keep pressing. Do you think that this is a real attempt to start a violent conflict, or can we look at more like a holdup? In other words, we're going to line up. We got two ships now in the South China Sea, two aircraft carriers I saw in the paper this morning. Yeah. We also have this aggressive forward policy in Belarus with the Navalny and all of this agitation against Putin. Is this like a gang of rich people just threatening, saying, if you don't do this, I'll blow your house down, and once you cough up the money, then we're okay for the next 30 days? Or are they really want to fire off their missiles?
Well, if they really want to fire off missiles, they're insane, because as Ted Postal, one of the leading experts on nuclear weapons at MIT, has pointed out repeatedly, no one will survive a nuclear war. And Postal has also pointed out that the Russian upgrading of their nuclear force, their nuclear deterrent, would make it almost impossible for us to win a sneak attack or a limited nuclear war. So if they really are talking about this, then they're completely insane. And some of them are. You remember the guy riding the bomb in Dr. Strangelove. I mean, there are still people around like that. But more importantly is the bigger issue here. The financial system is hanging by a thread, and they're moving like crazy around the Davos crowd, the so-called Great Reset, to create a new, even bigger than ever bubble, the so-called green bubble. And here's the problem they have. The Chinese pay lip service to it, but they're not going along with it. When Xi Jinping spoke to Davos, he said, yes, we support clean air, we support this policy, we're opposed to the escape of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And yet China is moving ahead on an energy mix that by 2030 will be 50% of electricity from clean coal and 50% from nuclear. That's not what the Davos billionaires have in mind. As for Russia, as Putin has quipped before, he said in Siberia, we could use some global warming. The Russians are not so worried about the so-called climate change because they see it as an excuse to attack other countries from developing new technologies. So the Davos crowd, and this includes a part of the military-industrial complex known as the social media networks, the computer companies and so on, who are now part of the military-industrial complex, they fear what would happen if Russia and China linked up with a country like Germany, where we're seeing some interesting changes starting to take place on environmental questions and economic questions and working with Russia and China. You could have a tilt away from the Anglo-American empire. And so, what better thing to do than use the Navalny case for a whole string of provocations against Russia, poking sticks in the bear's eye, and at the same time putting out the story of genocide against the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tibet, all the old stories of China without any evidence, just anonymous sources, to create the basis for a buildup. And of course, there's always the other benefit, John, which is more money for defense. And the people pulling the strings on these things, like the ones funding the Atlantic Council, the ones behind these policies, are the ones who benefit from the flow of $750 billion a year going into the defense budget.
Yeah. Let's talk about China for a minute. One of my favorite China stories was the one called Chinagate with the Clintons, and it just got buried and nobody really talks about it anymore. But I think that it wouldn't be too hard to draw a straight line from there to Joe Biden's son with the connections to the Chinese military and everything that was pointed out by Peter Schweitzer in his two books, Secret Empires and the other one, and otherwise. It seems kind of ironic to be, doing a great arms deal with China and then turn around and when you become the president to rattle the sabers at them at the same time. That's why I wonder if all this isn't just a what George Webb calls hair pulling. In other words, I'm going to grab your hair and we're going to look like we're fighting like crazy and it's going to look like a horrible girl fight. But in fact, nobody's really ever, going for the throat. Nobody's really hurting anybody. And at the same time, they get to do a lot of business. They get to make a lot, restock the inventory when they fire off the missiles. And that makes Raytheon happy. And you see where I'm going with that. So,
Sure.
What do you think's really behind this? Is it the arms industry wanting to make more sales, or is it a genuine interest of territorial fighting over these islands in the South China Sea?
What's the question of will the existing empire, which is primarily the United States, the Five Eyes, the Australia, New Zealand have some say in it, Canada a little bit, but it's basically US and United Kingdom intelligence and financial community trying to keep down China and Russia. Now, here's where the irony comes in. In the 90s and the first decade of the 20th century, the corporate networks that make US policy wanted the alliance with China because they were very happy to use China for cheap labor, cheap raw materials, no regulations, no clean air standards. Their costs were so much cheaper to produce things in China. They were delighted to be able to go over there and produce cheap goods and then sell them for a good markup in the United States and Europe. Now, the problem is the Chinese, at a certain point, didn't want to be like the South to the North in the 1800s. They wanted to have their own industrial development. And so they took advantage of the runaway industries to learn what we were doing, to master the technologies, through advanced science, in some cases, increase by huge volume the number of patents that were being filed. And with that, they started raising the standard of living of the Chinese people, which would make it more expensive and eventually too expensive for the corporations from the West to make the profits they expected from China. Now, what they figured is, well, okay, we can give that up as long as we can get our hands into the pool of money that China now has from us, from selling us all these goods, from the trade surplus China has, from all the US dollar denominated bonds and stocks the Chinese have. Maybe we can get that recycled back to our banking system. And the Chinese said, no, we're not going to do that. This is for our future development. And that's what's funding not just economic development in China, but the Belt and Road system. Now, that becomes a fundamental threat to the empire. So you have an empire that had a strategy of using the certain aspects of China, the cheap labor and other things, to make profits, but fearful that if China breaks out of this semi-colonial status, China may either seek revenge or may work with other countries to undermine the supply chains that the US has lost by defaulting every area of production to China. So you have a potential for a confrontation. And this is what one prominent geopolitician calls the Thucydides trap. Whenever one country rises and another one declines, you end up with wars. Well, the Chinese are smart enough to know that they don't want a war with the United States. And most American theoreticians know that a war with China would be a disaster. So the question is, what do you do? Do you carry out regime change in China? Do you undermine them? Do you target the yuan? Do you target China's leaders? Or do you reach agreements? Now, Trump started out on the path toward reaching agreements, using the still relative strength of the United States to China to say, look, let's get this trade deal done. No more unfair trading practices. We're not going to go into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was part of Obama's pivot to Asia. And the Chinese said, okay, that's a good start. But what happened is that got hijacked in March of 2020, when the United States was hit with the COVID crisis, and Trump decided to stop blaming Bush and Obama for their austerity policies on the public health system, which was the real cause of the unpreparedness in the United States, not that China somehow concocted a biological weapon and sent it to us, but that we had dismantled our public health sector to save money and to privatize it. So we were vulnerable. And Lyndon LaRouche wrote years ago that the West is very vulnerable to a pandemic. So as that happened, Trump was convinced by a number of his advisors, blame China. And I think had he won a second term, he would have gone back to Xi Jinping and said, all right, let's go ahead with phase two. Let's get over this pandemic question and start working on phase two of the trade deal. Now, what's Biden going to do? I personally don't buy this line that Biden is in the pocket of the Chinese Communist Party. Or I don't buy the line of some Republicans that Biden's a socialist or a communist. The guy's a multimillionaire. He's not giving away his wealth. You know, the people who are running the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, they're not trying to redistribute the income. They're trying to grab it all for themselves. You know, there's a fundamental disconnect between people who think these are socialists and the reality. The reality is they're what used to be called synarchists, which means that was a French term in the 1920s and 30s, that Americans understood that as corporate control, taking away the sovereignty of nation states, giving the power to corporations, and using left and right conflicts to keep the population diverted and killing each other. Now, what does that sound like? That's what happened in Italy. That's what happened with Nazi Germany. And that's where George Shultz comes in, because his father was part of the network at 120 Broadway in New York City of the Morgan, Harriman, Rockefeller interests, who had cartel arrangements with the Nazis into the war, into 1942, 1943. Harriman's bank, Union Bank Corporation of New York, on which one of the board members was Prescott Bush, was funding Thyssen, who gave money to Hitler until 1942, after we were already at war with Germany. So when you understand what these cartels are, these corporate cartels, they're not socialist or communist. They use this left-right duality to play people off against each other. They're greedy billionaires who love power. They used to be millionaires, now they're billionaires. And they'll do whatever they think they have to do to maintain that power. And that's where the war danger comes in. And ultimately, to get back to your question, most of them think they can get a backroom deal with Russia or China to avoid war. Some of them may think that they can play Russia off against China or China off against Russia, as Kissinger believed. But I think this is very dangerous business, and it's not in the interest of the American people to be caught in these geopolitical games.
I think you've said so much that's important, and I don't know how to say it any louder than I can to say, folks, support the LaRouche organization and support Harley Schlanger's writing and the great work they do, based upon decades of research, decades of interviews, and the type of knowledge that can only be amassed through a lot of investment of time and energy and late nights. So let's be sure and support those people that are helping us. And that one thing that bothers me about the financial situation right now is that at some point, right, and we talk about Germany and the crash of the German mark after the First World War, and it looks to me like there's either a real strategy, or it's kind of like the oligarchical machine has just defaulted into a point where the dollar is going to get ground down to nothing. Right now, it looks very vulnerable. And I saw a little headline this morning that Biden's policies are going to cause inflation. Well, I haven't studied that. I don't know if it's true or not, but it wouldn't take a lot to turn this thing into a rout because of the incredible lack of there's no there in the economy anymore.
There's already inflation. I can tell you, just as an example, in Germany last month, utility prices went up 7% because they're trying to underwrite the so-called sustainable energy production, which is cost ineffective. And they're shutting down those things that are effective, like coal, nuclear, and oil and gas. Now, the other thing is they're pumping trillions of dollars, some of it disguised as a COVID relief package, some of it disguised as quantitative easing, some of it government buying, the Federal Reserve buying government bonds, buying bonds from banks, buying junk bonds from corporations, allowing the corporations to continue to issue financial paper even while they're not turning a profit. The recent example of GameStop should give people an indication of what the real issue is, except the media is so corrupt, they won't tell you what's really going on. They make it the little guys through Reddit targeting the big hedge funds like Citadel and others. It's nonsense. It's internecine warfare. This is why ultimately the Great Reset won't succeed, because these guys have no honor. You know the saying, there's no honor among thieves?
Yeah.
BlackRock was involved in providing intelligence and funding to the assault on the hedge funds by buying up the derivative shares related to GameStop to produce more money. Now, the issue of money floating around, of liquidity, is important. And I know we've talked about it before, but this is something that really isn't so difficult. But when people hear economics and finance, they start glazing over, and they shouldn't. What happens when you provide liquidity to someone who's bankrupt without putting them through a reorganization? They're going to keep doing what they were doing, keep everything in place, build up a new debt bubble, a bigger debt bubble. So liquidity is not the solution. But if you listen to Janet Yellen with her during her confirmation hearings, if you listen to Jerome Powell, they're all saying, well, we will give all the liquidity that's necessary to keep the system flowing and functioning. Well, they're creating liquidity that's going to insolvent companies to pay the interest on debt for companies that can't make enough money to pay the interest on their debt, much less the debt. That's what's happening. And so this is not a solution. This is a new bubble. Now they're trying to create a green bubble, a carbon bubble, where what the line on this from Davos was, let's not burden governments any further with new debt, because the governments at some point may jump in to regulate it. Let's let the private sector determine not just the flow of money, but also the spending policy. Now, you know what that is? That's a banker's dictatorship. That's what was the goal in building the Hitler government in Germany of the British, to have German militarism to crush anyone that opposed the debt creation or the payment of the debt from the Versailles Agreement. So the idea is if you can create new credit out of thin air and impose it on people who have no ability to fight it back because their government's taken over by corporations, the corporations will loot. They'll continue to make money while the population suffers. That's the model. And I'll introduce a term for people that they may not know. It's called Schachtian economics. It's named after Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's finance minister. Now, you mentioned the Weimar hyperinflation. John, you know where Schacht got his start? He was brought in to impose the austerity in Germany that stopped the Weimar hyperinflation. He was working with Montague Norman of the Bank of England and the Harriman, Rockefeller, Morgan interests in the United States, looting Germany. The concentration camps started as slave labor camps for the big cartels like Thyssen and Krupp, who were in business with American companies. That's why if you look at the world today, when people talk about the corporate globalists, that's what we're talking about. They have no loyalty to the American people or to the French people or the German people, just to their own boards of directors and their interlinking corporate cartels. And that's why we have to be very clear when we say, is this socialism? Is it fascism? It is a form of fascism. It's corporate fascism. That's what it was called in the 20s and 30s. That's what Mussolini called it, corporatism. And that's what it used to be known as. But now they've changed it in the history books. So all you know about the Nazis is anti-Semitism, gas chambers, the swastika, and you don't know what was actually involved and who put them in power and why. And I think that's something that Lyndon LaRouche always emphasized when he was out organizing and running for president, that you have people today who are Nazis who don't wear swastikas and jackboots. But he used to say they're killing people with systems analysis and briefcases. You know, they're pushing policies such as the conditionality policies of the IMF that are killing large numbers of people in poor countries through the International Monetary Fund looting. And now it's turning against the advanced sector. So that's why the situation is so dangerous. And that, by the way, that's also why I wrote the story on George Shultz, because he's one of the pivotal figures in shifting from the jackbooted Nazis to the three-piece suit Nazis running Wall Street in the city of London today.
The couple of themes just to bounce back at you, and then I want to do a good deep dive on George P. Shultz. But it seems to me there's a definite pattern here from Roosevelt to Kennedy and then to Trump, in that these are people who took office with the intention of being a sovereign nation that respects the sovereignty of other nations. They had no clue to what Fletcher Prouty has turned us on to, and all of the people that were on the inside saying, no, there's a secret team up here that we don't observe national boundaries. We don't care about that stuff. We have special privileges and we do whatever we want to in order to advance our cause. And we, and who do they work for but Wall Street, the CIA, that whole secret team that is really has enough power to engage U.S. military. As we were reading last night from the new book JFK versus Allen Dulles by Greg Poulgrain. It's the latest one on my reading list. And the point I'm trying to get to is that there's a constant there's a constant empire that seems to be always jealously pressing against any new concentration of enough wealth that could actually be free of the empire. So that the Americans now, we are now the most vulnerable target, I think, because we still want to be free of that empire that we fought to get away from in 1776, if I may be so trite as to repeat that. The empire is still there, and they're pressing and pressing and pressing all the time. And I think Joe Biden is an empire um, tool, a person who has spent his career advancing the interests of that empire, which I just call it the empire because it's where all the money is, and
Mhm.
that's how that's how they're taking us down right now, by using financial instruments and undermining our economy in so many ways. So that's just like the theme of history is we need to educate people that, hey, there is the republic system with sovereignty, and then there's the empire system where all you want to do is take, 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 and you don't respect anybody else's sovereignty because your job is to get everything you possibly can and hoard it to yourself. Those are real models that are engaged in conflict today, and nobody is standing up for the republic anymore. Everybody is like, well, it's your fault, it's your fault, personality fighting. um, your organization and a number of small efforts like mine are going to have to do for now. But is there any hope for spreading the word in a more general way? We used to think Trump was going to start an internet channel or something, and that never happened. You guys are working hard to get your word out, but I think we need to do something almost explosive to try to get people to wake up and say, we got to stop this because we are a runaway train going to go off the cliff.
You know, I mean, sometime, John, when we have a couple of hours, we should go into the history of empire, because this is the history of the human race. As you point out, there have been quite often movements, including this is what early Christianity was, movements which are based on the idea of the dignity and sacredness of the individual human life, which goes against an empire which sees people as potential slaves to be exploited, whether they're slaves who work the land or slaves to credit cards and consumerism. It's still the same system. It's an empire, and it's very different from the idea of a republic. Now, you mentioned FDR and John F. Kennedy. Uh, FDR has been maligned and slandered quite a bit. Some people call him a socialist, some people call him a phony. All sorts of money has gone into attacking him. But what did he do when he was president? He did stand up for the working guy. He did fight against the banks. Glass-Steagall was aimed at the Morgan, Rockefeller, DuPont interests. It was aimed at the cartels. They say Teddy Roosevelt was the trust buster. He really didn't bust trusts. He busted the trusts that his friends didn't like. Franklin Roosevelt actually was the trust buster, going after the cartels through the so-called hellhound of Wall Street, who was running the investigation, Ferdinand Pecora, the investigation into the corruption of the banks. So Kennedy understood this. And if you read his speeches during the 50s, and I know you're very much attuned to this, Kennedy was anti-colonial. Kennedy actually believed that we should function as a republic. And had he stayed alive, I'm sure that he would have done much to break the Cold War stranglehold on policy. But that's who killed him. That's what he was up against. Now, Trump, was the similar kind of thing, except the deep state is so entrenched in the State Department, in the diplomatic corps, in the Defense Department, in all of these areas, Justice Department, that Trump didn't know where to turn. And he got a lot of bad advice. His instincts, I think, were good. I think they were shaped by a commitment to the American Republic, to the Constitution. But he did make mistakes, and his biggest mistake was to give the lead to Paul Ryan and then Mitch McConnell on economic policy. Had Trump worked out a deal initially with the Democrats on infrastructure, and I don't mean with Pelosi and Schumer because they didn't want a deal, but there were Democrats like Marcy Kaptur, quite a few of them, who would have gone along with the idea of an infrastructure plan and use that to shift credit from the Federal Reserve, which was there to bail out banks, to some kind of national infrastructure bank to fund major projects that would create productive jobs. That would have changed everything. And then he would have had to use Glass-Steagall to crack down on the bankrupt investment banks, the hedge funds, the shadow banking system. But he didn't do that, partly because Mnuchin was there, partly because he had a whole team of Wall Street people, including Kudlow, who undercut him whenever he tried to do something like that. Then what was he left with? Praising the up value of the stock market bubble as a sign of economic recovery. Remember, he correctly attacked Hillary Clinton in the 2016 campaign when she said Obama created a recovery. He said, no, it was a stock market bubble. It was not a real recovery of the physical economy. Had he stuck with that and fought that out, I think we'd be in a very different situation. Now, I don't blame him because I think he was under so much pressure. Well, I do blame him a little bit, but he was under so much pressure that with the Russia Gate, with all these stories, that it was almost impossible for him to maneuver. But I think he should have done more. He should have relied on the real patriots around him, someone like Bill Binney. I'll just remind people of this story. Trump asked Pompeo, when Pompeo was the head of the CIA, to talk to Bill Binney, because Binney, who had been technical director of the NSA and then became a whistleblower against the metadata collection, Binney did his own study and proved that Russia did not hack the Podesta email, the Clinton DNC emails, but it was an inside job. He proved it. And Trump heard about it and told Pompeo, who was the CIA director, to meet with Binney and hear him out. Binney laid it out to him. Pompeo said, that's very interesting, but my people at the CIA don't agree, and I have to stick with them. Now, I think we know enough about Pompeo now to know that he's part of the deep state. But at that point, you had an opportunity to completely shut down Russiagate. And you had the same opportunity. Had you had a CIA director who was with Trump, they would have shown what Brennan and Clapper and the Obama team were doing to set up the phony Russiagate story. But it didn't happen. And so when you say we're up against an empire, that's the empire. And now it's an empire that uses social media, that uses AI, artificial intelligence, uses all kinds of modern weapons, including the mainstream media, to disorient, deflect, and keep the American people ignorant about the actual threat to our future. So, when you and I talk about it, we're talking to hundreds, thousands of people, not a huge number of people, but every one of them is precious for the spread of these ideas. And I can only encourage your viewers and people who have come to our website to not be intimidated by the web of lies and censorship, but to fight for these ideas. And by fighting for them, I don't mean go shoot people. I mean, use your mind the way a boxer uses his fists, to challenge people, to point out the ironies, to get them to actually realize the extent to which they're being bamboozled. This is a method that works. And, I have met enough of your viewers now, John, to know that you have very discerning viewers. They don't always agree with you or me on everything, but they know there's something wrong and they're seeking answers. That's the starting point. And I think if we get enough people on this, these contradictions are going to come out in droves. How is a Green New Deal going to change the climate? It's not. What it's going to do is make us run short of electricity. We're not going to have enough clean drinking water because you need electricity to clean water. We're not going to have enough food because they're trying to shut down modern agriculture by saying people eat too much meat and put too much fertilizer into the ground. So we're being blamed for something that's caused by the atmosphere, solar radiation, you might say caused by God, not by man. And so, we've got to fight these things out.
Yes, and well, we're doing it. We're doing the best we can here at McDuff Channel to try to get the word out. And I also, I'm always every day. It seems like I'm on my personal Facebook trying to just craft the right message to wake somebody up. Please, just see the irony in what I've just said. Today's was I figured it out, Harley. The National Security Agency has determined that allowing citizens to alter policy by voting is a danger to national security.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're saying. There's this guy, what's his name? Let me get it for you here. Richard Grenier, who's the former head of counterterrorism at the CIA, who gave an interview with NPR. And he said, what we have in the United States now with the pro-Trump movement is something very similar to the environment that created ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And what he called for is using the counter-terror methods of the war on terror to combat it. Now, what's he talking about? Enhanced surveillance, waterboarding, droning people. You know, this is really getting very serious when you have the former head of counterterrorism making these kinds of claims. But you mentioned irony. Vladimir Putin came up with a pretty good irony the other day. He was in his talk with, I think it was one of the European Union people who was saying to him, "Why are you suppressing Navalny?" Now, this occurred the day after the Russian Secret Service, the FSB, released a video from 2012 showing a guy named Vladimir Ashurkov, who was the head of the anti-corruption operation under Navalny, meeting at the British embassy with an MI6 operative asking for $10 to $20 million a month so they could build the movement to overthrow Putin. Now, here you have the absolute proof that Navalny was trying to get money and support from the British Empire to overthrow Putin. So Putin raised the question, why is it that in the United States, social media is censoring the opposition, and that's good, but in Russia, social media is promoting the corrupt networks such as Navalny, who's on the payroll of the CIA and MI6. There's an irony. Now, people should think about that. You know, Putin is having quite an effect on Europe right now. One other irony, we're told Russia's a secondary power, it's not very good. But what did they just do? They developed a vaccine which is considered as good or better than the ones in the West, and they're willing to make it available to Europe when the European Union stupidly didn't order enough for the countries that it represents. So all of a sudden, Putin is seen by many in Europe as a hero, whereas Angela Merkel, Ursula von der Leyen, and the EU bureaucrats are seen as bumbling incompetents who owe their positions to big pharma and the cartels. So these contradictions are coming out, John. It's just a question of, you know, can people get their minds wrapped around the fact that there are so many competing narratives. And this is one of the reasons also why I've been taking up this whole question of QAnon, because you have a whole number of people who bought into this because some of the intelligence that was coming out was good. But it was intelligence that I had. It was intelligence that we were putting out. Lots of people had it about the role of the deep state. But what Q kept saying is trust the plan, trust the plan. The good guys are going to come in. And so many people were fully expecting that something would be done to overturn the election fraud and put Trump in the White House. Well, it didn't happen. Why? Because there never was a gang of white hats that were there to do good for the general public. The white hats, the good guys, have to be us, the people, using our minds to fight against this tyranny.
Q certainly did abuse a lot of people, and my instincts must be pretty good, because the very first time I saw Q, I saw what he was doing, this breadcrumbing thing where they say, you know, they give you a little hint and then you have to go and follow it up. And in the process of following it up, you get hooked on the theme, but the theme itself is based on fraudulent information. And
my joke on that is the Q-tip is brainwashing occurs in little drops.
Well, Remember when they brought out John F. Kennedy Jr. and they were saying, JFK Jr. is alive, and they had pictures of him with Trump and everything. That was a Q thing. But that type of thing, gets eyeballs. It's like, wow, that's exciting. I got to see this. I got to read this. It is just another tactic, I guess, to distract us from the truth.
There's stories out there from some of these Q interpreters that 109 present and former senators have been arrested in the last week, that Biden's under arrest, that everything he's doing is from a studio in California. He's not in the White House. And you have people who are well-meaning people who really don't like the direction of the country under the Biden-Obama team, because that's really what it is, who are sitting there glued to the internet hoping that this is all true, when it's not true. And what's necessary is to understand how psychological warfare works. Part of it is designed to give people a belief that something good will come out of other people's actions, and you just have to be loyal to those other people. That's not how it works. The American Revolution was not made by people who were looking for internet clues as to where George Washington was going to strike next. It was people who put down their plows and put down shuttered their businesses and went and joined the Continental Army or contributed to the Continental Army. So, when you're in this kind of intelligence warfare, which is not a shooting war, and I know this is something that you run up against all the time, you have people who say, well, this is good information. Thanks for the information. Well, it's not information. There's a difference between reality and psychological warfare. And unfortunately, because of a destruction of education, because of the effectiveness of the British psychological conditioning methods, people don't know how to fight it. I want to just use that to segue to something on the Schultz question, because, Schultz studied in college under a man named Kurt Lewin, who was from Tavistock Institute. This is at MIT. Schultz ran in the Lewin, and then Lewin was essentially a brainwasher who was trying to figure out how can you conduct speed up to get more work out of people without having to have jackboots and whips to force them to work harder. And this was a whole method of psychological coercion that Schultz bought into. Now, why is this important? One of the things Schultz did was give full backing during the Nixon administration to the Chicago boys who pulled off the coup in Chile that overthrew Salvador Allende. They killed Allende, they killed a lot of people in Chile, and they brought in corporations, private sector, to run the government, to steal the state pension funds and put people on privatized pensions, which, by the way, have never been paid. And Schultz said, well, Pinochet, who was the dictator they supported, Pinochet's methods were sometimes brutal, but at least it allowed for foreign investment to come into Chile. Well, the foreign investment came into the copper mines, which once Allende was killed, the workers had no unions and had to work again for low wages. So that's why I say that Schultz was the original economic hitman. He worked for the bankers using more modern, sophisticated psychological warfare to squeeze the extra profit that was needed by the bankers and the corporations. So, if people go and read my article, there are a whole bunch of examples I give of points where Schultz intervened. He was also the key person who convinced Richard Nixon to take the dollar off the gold standard, the gold reserve, in 1971. Not the gold standard, but the gold reserve. On August 15th, 1971, Nixon ended Franklin Roosevelt's Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system, which opened the door for what we have today of Ponzi scheme level speculation on everything, on currencies, on raw materials, on Super Bowl bets, derivative systems. All of this goes back to Schultz teaming up with Arthur Burns to convince a bewildered Richard Nixon to break the relationship between the dollar and gold. So Schultz was on the scene virtually every major shift that occurred toward the post-industrial speculative economy. He was a big backer, for example, in the Reagan administration of Thatcher's Big Bang, which deregulated everything. So that's why I thought it was important to write something about this guy's career.
Oh yeah, and then also the business with the Soviet Union back in the 30s and 40s when he was in cahoots with who was it, Arm & Hammer or somebody that they were.
His father, Schultz lived to be 100, but he was still a young man in the 30s and 40s. His father, out of the offices at 120 Broadway, this is where you had the Harrimans, Rockefeller, Morgan interests, DuPont, which were building the cartels, which were financing both the Stalinist shift toward some trade with the West, but at the same time, they were funding the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
That's his father's career. Now, Schultz, the other thing that Schultz is somewhat known for is something called the Revolution in Military Affairs, which he undertook with Felix Rohatyn of Lazard Frères Investment Bank. Lazard Frères, of course, was the founder of that, was Eugene Meyer, who owned the Washington Post, played a big role in covering up what the CIA was doing during the Kennedy era. But anyway, Felix Rohatyn at Lazard Frères and Schultz worked with people like Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, and Cheney in the Revolution of Military Affairs, which started privatizing the security services, privatizing elements of the military, and also integrating into US defense policy the Silicon Valley tech companies. So that was another thing that Schultz was very much involved in.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was 50 years ago. My dad died June the 6th of 71. And so George Schultz has had 50 years almost on my dad to accomplish what he has accomplished. And I can just imagine the world would have been in such a different place if they had traded places and my father had been in the position to make all those decisions, because he would have sided with we the people every time. Yeah, but it's a milestone, and the shadow of what he's done is just cast upon all of us for the rest of our lives, no matter what. Now, it's a terrible, terrible legacy to leave behind.
Tragedy that people didn't know better. People thought he was competent, that he was one of the adults in the room. And this is where the sleight of hand with the media comes in. Someone like Schultz, who was, maybe he wasn't a cold-blooded killer with his own hands, but he certainly propped up the people who were, got them the funds, got them the support to do the dirty work, like Pinochet. And yet he escaped as a so-called senior figure. Remember, in 1999, he was the person who brought together a team at his house in Palo Alto, California, that included Condoleezza Rice, Cheney, and others, that vetted George W. Bush. And when Schultz said Bush is ready to be president, the word went out to all the big Republican money bags, and that pretty much cinched that W. Bush would become the next president. So Schultz, his personal role was extremely important, but it's a tragedy that people went along with it and tolerated it and gave him this idea, this moniker of being a senior statesman.
Well, my last thought for the day is Jubilee. I think it's time for a Jubilee. We're just going to make everybody's debts go away. No debts can be enforced after the first day of 2022. Everything's gone. Clean slate all around, start over. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a good idea. The question is, how do you get it implemented?
Well, we're going to run a Jubilee political party. We're going to take over the U.S. Congress. By popular demand, we're going to require the Congress to pass a law that says you cannot enforce any debts that were incurred before January 1st, 2022, just like the continental governments did in the time of the Revolution. part of the reason that a lot of the states in the Middle Atlantic area were conducive to rebelling was because of the impending debts that kept coming as the tobacco prices went down, as you recall. Well, the courts just said, no, we're not going to listen to any complaints about debt right now. Just shut it down. So that's what I would do. Shut him down.
Combine that then with the policy to make sure that debts don't build up in the future, because that's where Hamilton came in. Hamilton said a well-managed public debt is a national blessing. And the way you manage the public debt is you create new technologies that increase your productivity so that your value added in the production process more than covers the costs that go into it. That's the American system. Unfortunately, it can't coexist with Ponzi schemes and scam artists like Bezos and Zuckerberg and the current crew on Wall Street, Leon Black and that whole crowd.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll take up some more of this the next time. I thank you so much, Harley, for spending some more time with us here in a snowy, dark evening in Berlin, Germany.
Well, people can lighten up my day by sending me emails on what you think of this discussion. Uh, Ask for, if you want to, you can get from me a link to the blog page, and I'll send you a link so you can sign up for free. Just tell me that you heard this on McDuff. So my email address is harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com.
All right, everybody, the LaRoucheOrganization.com and Harley sch@gmail. Thanks very much, Harley, and we'll talk to you again soon. I look forward to it.
Okay, John. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you.